Okay, today we're doing a podcast about the MEM training package. This is the first of the MSA podcasts that we've got planned. We've got a number of podcasts planned as we go forward over the next 12 months. But our guests today are Ian Curry and Richard Jenkins. I might start by, first of all, introducing myself and the role that I play in relation to this particular podcast. I'm the Executive Officer of Manufacturing Skills Australia and have responsibility for looking after a number of different projects and programs that MSA now undertake, one of them being scholarships. I personally look after the ITAB in New South Wales, and we look after general vet issues that are considered for the manufacturing sector, and promotion and education of education related issues to skills and workforce development in New South Wales primarily, but across Australia. And that's mainly the objective of what this podcast is here to do, is to promote and inform what the involvement of MSA is in the development of workforce development, or has historically been in the development of the MEM package. We're no longer got responsibility primarily for it, but as an ITAB, I do participate in informing that work on a national basis with a new organisation that has now taken over that responsibility, Manufacturing Skills Alliance, that are based in Melbourne. Some of the podcasts that we've got planned in the near future are, Karen O'Reilly-Briggs on some research she's done for us just recently on the future of education and of vet in manufacturing. We've got a focus on the MES, the Manufacturing and Engineering Assessment System, trying to reinvigorate that as it historically has been a key part of what is the MEM training package. A review of the history of MEM and award restructuring and how it's shaped the current vet environment, and non-MEM sectors that we want to cover in the future around process manufacturing and food processing, etc., aerospace and so on. So without any further ado, I might just start to kick off with introduction from Ian.
Ian Curry. I'm a retired AMWU official, Australian Manufacturing Workers Union official. 30 odd years of involvement in skills training and apprenticeship issues, and finished my time up a little over a year ago as the National Coordinator Skills Training and Apprenticeships for the AMWU. And I've got a very deep, keen interest in skills related matters going forward, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. Should be good and lively.
Richard.
Thanks, Leon. I've been involved in the MEM training package in one capacity or another since 1988. Where I first started as the National Coordinator of a joint project between the then MTIA and MTFU. I spent 10 years then working as the National Manager of Training Policy for MTIA, and later it became AI Group. Since 1999 I've been working for myself as a consultant, with probably 70-80% of the work being review and development of the qualifications and training packages, with some of the main work over the years being work on MEM. Probably no individual consultant has done as much work on MEM as I have. Ian and I have known each other for a long time. Collectively in this room, counting yourself, we've probably got an estimate of about 80 or 90 years together working on MEM. So we're here to, in my view, to use that knowledge, try and pass it on. We're not in any way representing any organisation, though we're all involved in MSA. No, I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, and I think, I'm not sure if you both mentioned it, but both play leadership roles within the organisation Richard as the chair of MSA nationally, and has been the deputy chair at the national level, and is currently the ITAB chair for New South Wales. So there's a significant ongoing, despite the traditional roles that you've had in industrial parties, you're still playing a significant role in workforce development and skills development for the manufacturing sector. All right, so we just might kick it off with some background on MEM and the competency standards. It's quite a maligned issue. A lot of people don't understand its history. So who would like to kick it off and just give us a brief history?
Should have tossed the coin.
Toss the coin.
We both go back a long way.
I think Richard, and then I'll correct any.
Well, I probably, at a national level, started on it a bit earlier than
that's right.
Ian. I think just quickly covering the history is that the competency standards came into focus over discussions that happened within what later became known as award restructuring. But you can trace a line back to Australia Reconstructed and other reports in the mid-1980s that were looking to, if you like, remove barriers to productivity, to people being able to progress within the industry. Gradually those discussions brought into focus that there is a need to be able to describe the skills that were needed in the industry in a formal way, to allow companies to focus on their skills development, to allow employees to focus on the careers they wanted in the industry, and to allow the industry collectively to say to the vocational training system, these are the skills we actually want, and this is the way we want them delivered, this is the way we want them packaged. Those discussions eventually coalesced around the idea of having some competency standards to describe the skills that are needed in the industry and were needed back then. We wanted to move away collectively as an industry from the previous environment in the award and in a lot of it where you were just focused on the tasks. We wanted to bring a focus in on the skills. The first draft of the MEM competency standards was actually delivered to the industry parties in December 1990, I think. So they predate the training package by 6 or 7 years. There's been a long history on actually having competency standards as descriptions of the skills that are needed in industry. Later they got packaged into qualifications, and when the training system changed in the middle 1990s to bring in training packages, the standards were used to form the MEM training package. But they go back a long way, and they are a sort of joint tool for parties and for people at the workplace level to know what skills we need and are trying to get delivered.
Okay. Ian, you got anything to add?
Well, I think what's overlooked in many senses is the boldness that it took for an organisation like the MPIA, an organisation of employers, the Metal Trades Federation of Unions, my former union, the AMWU. It took a fair bit of courage to sit down and have a full-on conversation about fundamental change to the nature of awards, the approach to vocational education and training. The apprenticeship system radically changed because of things like competency standards and the MEM package itself. So there was a lot of courage that was on display when they got together and said, instead of fighting over the minutiae of tasks and what work people do with what materials, what tools, who was allowed to use a ring spanner, who wasn't allowed to use a ring spanner. I started my apprenticeship in the rail industry in 1978. I could use a shifting spanner. I wasn't allowed to use a ring spanner. You had to be a fitter to use a ring spanner. So, there were all of these bizarre but understandable, in many senses, demarcations that were seen to be hampering things. We needed a different way of measuring the value of work. We needed different tools for job design, work organisation change, and the award restructuring that Richard referred to was a fundamental part of that. And the radical change that arose out of an industrial relations principle, the structural efficiency principle back in 88, 89, that was a fundamental change to the way people viewed the world of work, the tools that people had to engage with the world of work, and the opportunity for the first time to look beyond the horizon to where you might go as a worker in the industry in terms of classification, career path progression, and your status in the industry was not based on whether you used a ring spanner or a shifting spanner. It was based on where your skills could take you. So we didn't eliminate demarcations in the award restructuring process. What we did was give them a proper basis, and that basis was the limits of your skills, competence, and training. So that award restructuring process is taken for granted today, and it shouldn't be. It was an enormous risk for both unions and employers to sit down and try to find a better way of positioning an industry that is critically important to Australia's future, and that's as true today as it was then. So that was a fundamental change, and it changed things forever. And at the heart of that was the notion that skills should be the basis of work organisation, job design, productivity improvement, international competitiveness, career path progression. All of those things have their foundation on the concept of competency standards. The industry parties didn't set out to write training packages. Training packages are a construct of government. What we did try and do was put some definition around what skills were, what they meant, but also importantly what their value was for work organisation and job design. That allows us to think about the future of work, and as work evolves, the competency standards can evolve with them. And many of the things that we are starting to take for granted, whether it's automation, robotics, whether it's AI, can be accommodated in a pretty granular way by building on the competency standards platform that was established in 1990.
Right. So, I guess that is a good segue into understanding how the workplace drove this change. Can you tell us any more about, back when we first started down this pathway, and maybe we'll go to Richard first and get a bit of an insight about, who were the people who brought it to the table in the first place, the role of competency standards and the way we were going to develop skills into the future, which is we are in the future now, but we've got a future to go into as well.
Well, as I said at the beginnings, competency standards evolved out of broader discussions, but they've got two origins. The industry came up with the idea of competency standards itself out of national level discussions happening between key people in MTIA and the then MTFU, Metal Trades Federation of Unions, with the main union being the AMWU. Parallel to that, the Commonwealth Government was getting interested in developments in the United Kingdom at that time around developing competency standards over there in their national vocational qualification system. So when the industry in Australia came up with the idea of competency standards, it was fairly fortunate timing that we had a very receptive environment for that idea from governments. Because they were looking to change and improve the vocational training system. They had already decided that vocational training needed to be more industry-led, and we got support nationally to develop, the early drafts of the competency standards and to trial them for what we'll discuss later, the dual purposes of standards. But we when I say we, I mean they didn't. It was something pushed on the industry. It was something that came about from the industry itself, from that joint desire to move away from strictly defining how people work, the way Ian just described. You can use a ring spanner in one job but not in another job.
So was productivity the driver primarily?
Well, there were two. I always say there were a couple of drivers, one, all leading to productivity, but the employees wanted better career paths. There were fairly hard barriers in the award back in 1988. You know, a process worker could only go a couple of levels. You know, unless they were lucky enough to get an apprenticeship when they left school. There were very few provisions around for adult apprenticeships. It was up to your own initiative to, spend your money to go off and study at night if you wanted to become a technician or someone higher. So there was a recognition that we had to remove barriers to career development. There was also a desire from the employer's side to, and I have a slight difference. I'd say the employer side wanted to get rid of demarcations completely. We wanted to bring in multi-skilling. The idea of multi-skilling wasn't just an efficiency or productivity idea, though. It was there to say people could develop, if I can use the analogy, in a horizontal way by adding to their basket of skills in different areas, as well as adding to their skills, if I like it to say, in a vertical way by learning more fitting or more welding or whatever it may be. But you could go into a different area, and we wanted to make that easier. And that had a productivity benefit for the employee and the employer.
From my memory, in the early sort of mid-90s, I should say, I worked for Boeing, or Hawker Haviland as it was, and I was going through a reclassification process, and this is where I first came across it as a process worker in composites. There was things like operating computers, which wasn't in the daily coverage of what someone would do, but it was a key demarcation issue that's something that people in an office did versus someone on the shop floor, but it was being brought in. So this was an ability to acknowledge that people were going to be using this skill. It was something that you wanted to build on, and that was going to raise productivity. And is that the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Well, yes, and I think too, there was a lot of technology change happening around the late 1980s. That's the period where computers really did start coming into the workplace. They weren't no longer just a tool you saw in an office. That, the use of keyboards to program and enter into information into machinery became more widespread. Robotics was coming in. There were developments in materials. There was a joint recognition that not only did we need to describe the skills that we wanted, but we had to make sure we developed sets of skills that were up to date and described how work was done. And later on we'll get into a description of all the extensive trialling that was done to achieve that. And there was a lot of trialling, a lot of discussions to make sure we were accurately describing what was the needed skills and how they were being used in the workplace.
And from your perspective?
Everything that Richard said's pretty right, but I think the fundamental change that occurred was a change in culture. It was a more balanced conversation about how the future of manufacturing could deliver for what were quite separate interests. The interests of workers and the interests of employers are not the same interest, but it showed that you can deliver on the interests of both using an agreed framework, and the framework was as much about cultural change. The demarcation issue, whether you're using a ring spanner or a shifting spanner, we didn't remove demarcations. What we did was redefine them on the basis of what are the limits of the worker's skill. So if you had the skills, if you had the knowledge, and the work allowed you to use that skill and knowledge, we needed a framework that could recognise and reward that and provide career progression, higher pay, more job satisfaction. Workers were starting to get more oversight of the more of the work. You were seeing more of the totality of the function. So the cultural change was incredibly important, and we stopped measuring jobs in terms of tools, in terms of what equipment you used or what product you worked on. I mean, we had an award that had, I think, 15 different types of smiths, tinsmiths, angle iron smiths, blacksmiths, silversmiths. The list is quite extensive, and it was about what material you worked with rather than what you did with that material. Yeah. So a fundamental change in the culture around work to say, if I have the skills, I should be able to do more of that work, instead of a really narrow view of demarcations which were about, I want that worker to do more, and that the conversation stops at doing more. Now we say that worker can do more, and we have a structure that rewards that, recognises that, encourages and promotes the acquisition of further skills, not only for the performance of physical work, but also the context that work takes place in. So facilitative skills like communication and the interactions between workers in terms of planning and things like that, we were giving life and definition to the skills that made individual workers able to collaborate more effectively with each other, to smooth out the sort of production process and the workflow by combining the skills of various workers to produce something in a dedicated, thoughtful, sort of purposeful way. And it put a real focus on job design, put a real focus on how work was organised, and we were able then to organise work around the capability of a workforce rather than a whole pile of individual workers operating almost in isolation. So that cultural aspect, I think, is the strength of it all. And that again goes back to that boldness and the courage of warring tribes in many ways, from the 70s into the 80s, who were battling over what proportion of the cake they were going to reserve for themselves. And then a boldness and a more international sort of flavour out of award restructuring and structural efficiency that promoted the notion of improving productivity, efficiency, the international competitiveness of the industry by introducing a range of things, one of which was skill-related career paths, etc., etc. All of those things stand the test of time. We're 30 odd years down the track. And those things work today as well as they worked back then. But it first and foremost, the advent of competency standards was in response to the industrial environment and the position that manufacturing found itself in way back then. And it became a debate about the future, not a debate about how you carve up the past. And that shouldn't be ignored, and it should be recognised. The leadership of the industrial parties at the time should be recognised. It was a bold move.
Yeah. So I guess the question I have, and relating to, this has been setting the scene. We're now in an environment again of what we'd see as significant change, and we're seeing all sorts of, I guess, approaches to try and address that change. Things like automation and robotics are hot topics at the moment. We're talking about advanced manufacturing, all catchphrases that are there to try and draw people to issues. Do you see the relevance now as much as you did back in the early 90s to using competency standards to create a future?
Absolutely. The environment is no different. The catchphrases are different. The technology is different. But what we came to terms with back in the 90s was that change was inevitable, that change could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on whether you went into it with fear and trepidation or whether you went into it with a sense of hope and purposefulness, if that's a word. But it's that sense of purpose. What change do we want to drive, and what are the underpinnings of that in terms of culture and skill and knowledge and technology, and how do we do that in a managed way? So again, another under-discussed part of that cultural change was new consultation and training provisions that gave the workforce rights to participate in the design of their own work, in the design of training regimes at the workplace level. So it was, a holistic approach that ticked so many of those boxes. And the tools that the tool that competency standards gives us to respond to changes, whether it's AI or whether it's any form of technology, automation, robotics and the like, you can design a response to changes in work using competency standards that exist, or if industry's given its way, to design completely new competency standards to evolve with the evolution of work. It's there. What's perhaps changed a little bit since the 90s is the concept of industry leadership of that process. Industrial parties back in the 90s were driving the design of competency standards and how they related to the world of work. That connection now is a lot more tenuous, and there is a lot more, governments have a far greater role in that, and it's not always the most constructive of roles. Industry, and I mean workers and employers, not industry as some sort of a coherent thing. It's not a coherent thing, it's all over the place. And it's a complex environment, but industry is still by far best placed to anticipate change, to drive change, to design change, to meet the needs of that change in an effective way. But you can't do that when training packages take 2-3 years to review and 4 or 5 years to be approved, and then you run into transition programs for old training packages to new training packages that go on for years, because the system doesn't deal with change as readily as industry has been forced to deal with change.
I think we should stay with the principle, and it was well accepted by governments at the beginning and still is in a formal way, that information that comes out of the workplace is the best information in terms of being able to decide, what skills are actually needed, whether we're talking about inside a company, a region, a state, or nationally. The problem is, and I'm sort of sympathetic and hard on it at the same time, you can't have 10,000 different versions of how we're going to train someone to weld or use a machine. So you need some type of vehicle that brings together that information in a way that, to use the word, standardises it, so that it can be used by the training system, it can be used by employers and employees, and it can be used by the parties nationally. These days it's only grey heads like Ian and I that remember a lot of the minute details about how it came about. But a lot of people have grown up only knowing, a 14 level classification system in the award. They're only knowing the use of standards for the qualifications they might go and get. But it's like, in other environments you might be doing business, but underneath it there's a layer of regulations, a layer of systems that support it. We don't want to go back to the old 350 classifications and the demarcations that Ian talked about, but people have got used to the fact that they're not there now and people don't talk that way. But underpinning it is the fact that a lot of effort goes into maintaining national skill descriptions that we call competency standards. And they, because vocational training is such a big sector, we're here today inside at TAFE College, they're delivering training based around competency standards in every part of the activities going on at this college, not just in manufacturing, but in hairdressing, in cooking or whatever. That at a fundamental level it's been accepted that industry should supply in a formal way descriptions of the skills that they want. And people sort of think of competency standards in an official way, but that's all they are. They are descriptions of the skills that industry are saying they need.
Can I just interrupt there for a minute? I guess one of the things that I have questioned about, and we're seeing a proliferation at the moment of interest, and there's a lot of discussion about speed to delivery. And Ian has already just described, I guess the trajectory or the timeline of getting something from initiation to implementation. We're seeing now the possibility of things like micro-credentials, new courses that are focused on technology, not on skills. And I think that was probably the earmark, particularly the MEM package. It was focused on skills, not on tasks, which, you look at a lot of other training packages, they are task orientated or process orientated rather than skills, which I think has been, one of the great things about the MEM.
I think there's a few issues in your, but look, speed to market is not inherently let's say a factor only related to training packages. They have suffered from problems around speed to market. But I remember way back in the curriculum days when we were trying to get the national curriculum, and manufacturing, a lot of TAFE teachers who might be listening to this podcast will remember the modules and the NMEC modules. They took years to develop and to agree amongst every state and territory training system. Years to get agreement on how they were going to be delivered and assessed, how they were going to be funded. It's not a unique feature of training packages. What we have, you could do a whole separate podcast on that issue, is that somehow VET suffers from speed to market problems. Partly because we want, employers and employees want a national system of training. We don't want 8, 10 different versions of electricians or fitters or whatever. But we do want the ability to customise and contextualise down to the needs of individual workplaces. But we also want a national recognition. People want a qualification and they want that issued by government. Getting agreement around that takes time, and they want it to be funded for many of the occupations, especially say apprenticeship occupations. Government set rules about how they want to set up that funding, how they want to approve it, how they want to approve the content. And we have a sort of railway gauge mentality in VET, because every state and territory system, every state and territory minister wants to approve the output of the national process of developing and reviewing training packages. Talking from an industry point of view, we know that's there, we have to deal with it. It's been a very, very hard thing for governments and bodies like MSA, when it was responsible for the training package, and Manufacturing Alliance, that is now responsible. It's been a very, very hard thing all the way through to solve this speed to market problem. Some people are saying micro-credentials are an answer to that. We can develop something, write up things in small packages, and that will solve the problem. Now, I'm not convinced of that, and I'm yet to see it, because whether you're talking about a small or large package of training, governments will still want to make decisions on funding it. They'll still want to make decisions around nominal hours for it. They'll still want to do quality audits of the delivery. They'll still want to manage the scope of registration of training providers. So the micro-credential argument is thrown around as a solution to, let's say, this speed to market problem. But there's often a lot of lack of detail about how the rest of that's going to be managed. I mean, some people in that micro-credential debate want to bring down, let's say, the authority to originate that qualification, to authorise it in a way so it carries recognition. And so we'll get some micro-credential developer in some small region say, we're going to do this, but is that going to get automatic recognition in South Australia or Western Australia? We'll only do that if it's based on competency standards or some other agreed mechanism of national recognition.
Yeah. So
can I just? There's two issues that about the micro-credentials, but also the frailties of federation, which we suffer from. So we've got 8 different training systems. Industry doesn't organise itself around state borders. Never have. You are forced to deal with regulatory environments that you operate in. What manufacturing has been founded and the success of manufacturing has been founded on is the notion of consistency, high quality, consistent approaches, high quality, consistent products. And we are losing some of the consistency whilst we go racing around for what I would call quick fix solutions that have more to do with what some training providers want to deliver rather than what industry is demanding. We are not demanding that welding take place in a particular way just in this region or just in that region. And those sorts of sort of local quick to market fixes often come at a cost of consistency. We're double, triple, quadruple handling a lot of the material around training resources and whatnot. We are losing that quality that comes from a well-debated approach to the construct of competency standards. Honor de Balzac said once that we do not attach ourselves lastingly to anything that has not cost us care, labour and longing. There's a backstory to that Richard and I have a chuckle about occasionally. But these things have stood the test of time. The award provisions that underpin the notion of competency as a means of describing and valuing work, as a means of assisting to redesign the way work is done, to redesign how jobs are constructed. That stuff has stood the test of time. There's been almost no change to any of those award provisions because the foresight that went into the development of them in the first place and the construct of competency standards as it was done originally provided the vehicle for solving problems even today. So the notion of consistency is important to industry, but it's incredibly important to workers themselves. When we started this process, those who did it, when we started this process, there was something of the order of 60% of the manufacturing workplace had no formal post-school qualifications whatsoever. If you're a technician or an engineer or a tradesperson, you got access to formal training. If you weren't, you learnt on the suck it and see principle. Mm-hmm. Now, those statistics have changed quite a bit, but not enough. We still have a lot of people who don't have access to formal delivery of training in order to get the skills they need for effective participation in work. And effective participation in work is an economic indicator of what your life's going to be like. So all of those sort of factors boil down to whether or not we have a training delivery system that can meet the needs that industry expresses through competency standards and qualifications. And it's that sort of order of business. Industry defines a need for skills to do work. They define that need, they offer it up into the formal training system, and we expect that delivery will meet that standard. We've got a break in that chain at the moment, and micro-credentials are fracturing and fragmenting our efforts to produce skilled workers. We don't want people with micro skills, we want people with the skills to engage in work effectively so that the economy's better off. We're replacing imports, we're exporting more, we're moving up the value chain, we're value adding to raw materials, we're doing all of the things that we've talked about from an industry development perspective for decades that were required. But every one of those things requires a skilled worker at the end of it.
Yeah. I think with micro-credentials has become a bit of the phrase of the day. What I said before though is you need to understand what surrounds that. Like competency standards have always been in bite-sized pieces. The modular curriculum was in bite-sized pieces. The competency standards in the old curriculum carried national recognition. I'm not against micro-credentials, but I like to know when I'm looking at someone promoting micro-credentials that it's surrounded by a sophisticated description of what's really being offered, if I can put it that way. Are we talking about a micro-credential that is going to be publicly funded? Because you've always had OEM training, manufacturers offering service courses and other training. In this debate that's going on often now, when we talk about a micro-credential, there's one thing to talk about a micro-credential that carries public funding. There's one thing to talk about a micro-credential that's carrying national recognition. Another thing to talk about a micro-credential that might be put together, in the right Lego block way to eventually tally up to a qualification. Some have been put together without that intent. I find when I look at the micro-credential discussions, there's usually 7 or 8 different types of micro-credentials being talked about when you tear away the descriptions. Some are good and some aren't so good. Some are going to benefit the employer more than they benefit the employee.
Or the training provider.
Yeah, but any type of training that allows it to be relevant and used in a good way in a workplace and allows it to be go towards someone's ability to be recognised for their skill, that's a good thing. But I just add that there's many different types of micro-credentials being talked about at the
And we've
moment.
always had them.
Yeah.
We used to call it post-trade training.
Yeah.
Or the sort of vendor training that was often the case. Our ability to recognise those things. I mean, this isn't about training. This is about training leading to skills that have value in the world of work. And we often forget that second part of it. And we have sophisticated structures industrially for recognising people's skills for classification, pay and career progression. And the myriad micro-credentials that are evolving are not part of that value system. And what value attaches to the worker's deployment of a micro-credential is up in the air.
Yeah.
And we've spent decades refining our approach to the design of work and jobs to produce more productive, more valuable workers, and we need to maintain that momentum.
If we talk about the MEM competency standards, there's been no industry that's been a more strong supporter of the idea of not having really large chunks of training that you have to do before you get any type of recognition or the employer can get any access to training their people. The metal and engineering industry from 1988 has supported whatever the vehicle was, whether we were talking about curriculum in module forms or later on we were talking about competency standards. And the employers and the unions were common in that. We used to say we wanted 20 or 40 hours of curriculum, or we wanted a competency standard that eventually we came up with a points way of recognising it. But we've always supported, let's say, micro blocks of training as a good thing to allow training to both carry national recognition but to be able to be managed at a local level in through the use of core and elective type arrangements, be able to be customised to the needs of the person being trained in their workplace. We could go on for a long time and say about the barriers to that. Most of those are institutional barriers.
Yeah.
In the people that have been responsible for designing the competency standards and designing the MEM qualifications, and Ian and I have both had and still have a finger in that pie, I do, at the moment. We try and do it in a way that maximises choice while still carrying recognition. And that's been a long aim, and it's still an aim. And so I'm not, I won't talk for it, I like to sometimes, but we still support the idea that there is good, healthy amounts of choice in vocational training.
But Richard alluded to something a little earlier that I want to just sort of pad out my own words. I've always said that the best source of advice about the skills and workforce development needs of industry is industry itself. It's the people doing the work, it's the people organising and supervising the work, it's the people that are planning and doing all of those things. It's a rare thing, I think, for success to come from people sitting around in a room like this, designing how work should be done somewhere else. So getting people in a workplace to sit down and contemplate how work could be done in a more effective, productive, safer, more consistent way. That can only happen with the input of those who are doing the work and are responsible for the management and planning and supervision of work. But more and more the role of the workplace is being diluted, and we are not giving full faith and credit to the intelligence that comes out of workplaces about how they want the training system to deliver for them. And that debate is the debate I think we should be having today, not about whether or not performance evidence should be accessible in this way or that way, and the regulatory burden that comes from having 8 different governments with a finger in the pie of what font should be used when you're typing up a training package. We've got to get down to the sort of brass tacks of what are the needs of workplaces, whether it's aged care, early childhood education, advanced manufacturing, naval shipbuilding, disability care. I mean, all of those things. The notion of the design of work and jobs, the source of intelligence about that can only be those that are engaged
I guess
in that work.
This system, and look, even when I entered into this sector of being at the leadership of VET and trying to develop, you know, the resources and the training package, and my role as the implementer in New South Wales as the ITAB, there's been a considerable, that they've always said that industry is at the centre of this. The thing that I've experienced is that a lot of the people who do end up at the centre of it are people who are self-serving. They're focusing on their own interests, and it's not broad consultation as it should have been. Even this system, as we're currently seeing it, a number of the new JSCs are just publishing their workforce plans. But they're focusing on a lot of the, like I mentioned earlier, the catchphrases around AI, advanced manufacturing and so on, and forgetting about what I've termed the legacy part of industry and the core of industry, which is those things that, you know, have to be done every day. You know, the fabricators that are out there in the workshop, welding, striking arc.
Blessed are the Boilermakers.
I knew I'd get a response from you on that. But even, you know, fitters and machinists, and, you know, we've got the advent now of additive manufacturing, 3D printing, but they're focusing on the 3D printing bit and forgetting about the rest, which is the foundation of our industry.
I think you, Leon, you touched on something. Each government, each VETCO turns itself inside out every 3 or 4 years with a report or review saying let's update the way we do things in VET. You know, there's a much stronger focus at the moment on workforce planning, and that's something that every Job and Skill Council's been told is one of their major purposes. We've got to be careful though that is not at the expense of making sure that the things that input into the actual training delivery, the competency standards, the qualifications, and then the delivery arrangements are not just assumed to automatically follow a workforce plan. Technology out in the workplaces, even in country workplaces that may be relatively small, moves very quickly. We see that all the time in our own computers and our own everyday technology and phones. Whether we're talking about robotics, automation, CNC, whatever it might be, the technology, you know, 2 or 3 years ago is different to what's being used now. Where there is a need to focus on how we stay in touch with how technology and skills are changing in the workplace. Now, the workforce plans are sort of a global attempt to, you know, research that and look at that, and to also look at supply and demand. But one characteristic of it is you have to get down at a much more micro level than that. You have to be able to, in any industry, to dig into their unit and say, in laboratory work, what has changed about the equipment in the laboratory? In the welding environment, what has changed about the materials or the machinery or the welding equipment, or in machining, what has changed? I would like to see a bit more focus on maintaining the speed to market at that, let's say, more micro level. Not saying it's a bad thing that we have a good, you know, strong focus on workforce planning, but it shouldn't be at the expense of trying to keep the content side of it up to date and current with what industry needs.
Could I So, I mean, the workforce planning, we get all hot and bothered about how many boiler makers we need, how many dental assistants we need, how many vets, all of that sort of thing at the occupational level, but we're not paying enough attention to what it means to be a boiler maker or a dental assistant. What are the skills and knowledge that are required to do that effectively? So we're not delving down into that level of detail. It needs to be far more granular. I remember the debate about planning for naval shipbuilding and submarines and future frigates. And you can identify exactly how many welders you need. But nobody was talking about what those welders would be doing in terms of what materials are welding, what sort of welding processes, what sort of non-destructive testing techniques, and we weren't getting down to what it meant to be a welder. So we often look at the big picture and we ignore the detail bit that matters. So we don't yet have a standard for welding around the country. Training packages attempt to do that in the way they go about their business, but that can often be undone by this sort of approach that states have. Welding's not a trade in Queensland. It is, I think, in every other state and territory in the country. So the state then starts to say, well, somehow it's different in our state or territory. I'm not sure it is, but so training packages have evolved to try and attempt to deal with that quandary of what should a welder look like. Flexibility is fine for those who can exploit the flexibility productively, but when flexibility is exercised for the purposes of being flexible rather than with a goal in mind, then you lose the impact of that. So we're caught between having enough flexibility in our training package qualifications for certain occupations and having too much flexibility so that you lose the central core of what it means to be a dental assistant. So you could technically in previous iterations, the flexibility rules were so ludicrous that you could create a competency profile for a welder that included no welding.
Yeah, I've heard of that one, particularly in one of the states where, for in fact, industrial painting, there was a number of units that sort of dealt with painting and industrial coatings in the MEM package, and it was manipulated to such a point, and as I believe, and you might be able to inform me better about this, but that was one of the main drivers behind the significant change that we've had in the latest iteration of the trade occupations and the requirement to have people with less, I guess, elective choice. I think there was about 800 units in the package at one point, and people could almost choose from any of those 800 units and create a 96-point trade at Cert 3. And they're, because employers trust that the heading on the qualification when they put it on their CV that it is what it is. So if you have someone with a fabrication trade, you expect that they can fabricate something. But in that instance, there was a case that, well, it has become a little bit novel, that they would not have in their testament and all the units that they've selected something that didn't support what that primary vocation intent was.
In MEM, we have a very big training package. 800 units, 39 qualifications. It's one of the biggest training packages around, covering a very large number of employers and employees. There's always been tension. Sometimes you get it more right, sometimes you get it more wrong. But there's always been tension between how do you set up competency standards or qualifications to enable that recognition that people want around the country. At the same time, how do you do it to give the flexibility people want to cater for regional needs or local company needs? People want portability, then they want flexibility.
And they also want consistency.
And there's compromises in that all the time.
Well, we're not talking about that in a sense with this notion of flexibility. What I arc up about is the notion that governments say you must have 1/3 of the units in a qualification through elective choice, whether you want that or not. We're dictating flexibility, which is ludicrous. There should be flexibility of choice, but you can't have endless flexibility. 1/3 from here, 1/6 from any training package you like, so you can create a Boilermaker profile that's got jewellery.
You can pick any rule in
It's
vet.
nonsense.
And, look, from the very beginning, ideally industry would have liked to have had a total say over what it wanted, but it's never had it. Even the very first iterations of the modules and later the standards had to go through the run of being accepted by governments, whether it was for funding purposes or to issuing of qualifications. If you didn't want to go through that process, have total freedom, you had to fund it, do a completely non-accredited fee-for-service environment with someone like you might go in these days and pay Microsoft to teach you all about Microsoft. But where we're dealing with accredited training, there's always been a tension between how industry can maximise the types of things it wants and deal with the types of things government want to mandate and say that they want. We've never had a system where anything we develop gets automatically funded. I understand that, that's what governments do, and they're dealing with our taxes and our money. So we have to work out ways of engaging with that process. Governments decided a long time ago that they wanted to nationally, leave aside WA and Victoria still having their own state qualifications authorities, but they wanted to offer a national system for recognition and registration of training providers. That, let's say, delivery side recognition, that ASCRA side has grown up parallel to the development and endorsement of training packages. And it's arguable now that the rules coming out of the recognition of training providers, for example, are as influential now on content and delivery of VET as the rules around the development and endorsement of training packages. That's a new system industry's got to try and work through and navigate with.
I think the point that I was trying to make though is that the flexibility that was there was being exploited, and there was some need to rein that in because standardisation, which is what we're talking about, is what the standards were, was not being aligned to the expectations of industry. We wanted to, if we were hiring a boilermaker or a fabricator, we were expecting that fabrication trade would actually align to the outcome.
Look, there's been work done. Ian was involved in R3, I was involved in MEM R4. You go right back, I project managed and led a complete review of MEM, and Ian was on the steering committee for it in 2005, the MEM R5 package. Part of the obligation to try and keep a training package and the MEM competency standards up to date is not just about trying to keep the content up to date, it's about trying to keep the packaging up to date, and that's what you're talking about. And we make judgments, those of us that have been working on it, saying where is the balance we're going to strike between flexibility and guaranteeing recognition around the country. Now, depending which sector you talk about in MEM, and it's not just a problem for MEM, but sticking with MEM, there's one expectation around, what are you going to have in terms of flexibility when you're writing a qualification to support a trade, for example, which will relate to contracts of training, to apprenticeship conditions, into an expectation that people will come out with a bit of paper that will mean something anywhere in the country. So that puts one set of issues on you when you try and design and write those standards and those qualifications. You get jobs at the technician level, for example, that aren't as surrounded by contracts of training, have rather looser but looser concepts about what the occupation is.
But we've lost touch with the nature of occupations. We've got this wild idea that every job in every place is different. Like a boilermaker is different here, and here, and it's that notion that flexibility and choice are more important than fitness for purpose. So it's almost an ideological position that we've got to maximise choice. Now, most employers that I've dealt with, I've done a lot of work around job design and classification profiling, occupational profiling all over the country for decades. We've all had a hand in that in one way, shape or form. And what I found is that employers cannot handle trawling through the endless amounts of choice that are being rammed down their throat. What they want is an element of certainty around the design of certain occupations. Now, if there are many occupations where there is an almost incoherence from workplace to workplace in what looks like the same job. Whether you're working on a counter in a convenience store or as a barista, there'll be a raft of different things. But in those central core occupations in Australia, the central trades, the technical workers, the health workers, the disability care workers, all of those, there is a stability in terms of what the occupational needs are.
I don't think I was arguing against that. I'm just saying there's a balance to be struck. And you started off by giving an example where at one point in time, let's say the qualification had been too far towards flexibility and it needed to be brought back.
I don't think
that's been part of the work.
I don't think I was saying that it was too flexible. I was saying that the opportunity for people to exploit that flexibility was there. The funding was wagging the dog. So people, the modification and the changes that happened in the MEM package actually was as a response to...
A direct response, a deliberate and conscious response to minimise opportunities for people to deliver something as a product differentiation rather than a product that's meeting the needs of the consumer.
Guard the credibility of the skills and the qualifications that were being earned.
I think that at the training package level, at the ComC standards level, we've always had more flexibility than you actually strike at the delivery point. Because we are trying to do it nationally. We depend on training providers and employers and employees taking, let's say, the menu that we've developed with some rules about selection and then making a choice, if you like, an additional level of choice on top of that to suit their environment. So we've not come in and said, here is exactly what everyone should study to be recognised as a boilermaker or a welder or a technician. We've had packaging rules, but we all know that there's no TAFE, for example, that offers every MEM unit and every elective.
But even that is being driven by the funding models that have been made available. So the choices in electives, and this is my experience, and I can only take my experience in New South Wales, is that the RTOs that are offering these qualifications focus primarily on how much it's going to cost them to deliver, how long it will take them to deliver,
and maximising student numbers in particular classes. And
they are really focused on the point at which they get paid. And it's not their fault. This is a policy issue that they are playing to the system, which you expect. Everybody will see a system and see how they can use it to their best advantage. And
isn't that the reality, though, Leon? We know when you develop ComC standards in the qualification that training providers will then make judgments about what will be their menu of units they offer. Hopefully they do that in a good way by consulting locally and working out what is the local need in their area. But I've always been a bit suspicious, and this is my personal view, of trying to fully identify down to the last point of selection what should be chosen in a
But no one's suggesting that.
No, I'm just saying that's always been my view, that
who's exercising the choice and flexibility that is, in my view, the problem, and it is not the employer or the student.
It's become a push. It's a push system instead of a pull system. So instead of the people who this is meant to serve, it's serving the people who are serving it up, and that's one of the things that I think is a concern. I think employers should get what they need. If they've got a requirement for the skills to convert raw materials into saleable product, whether that be a product itself or a service at a technical level, they should have expectation that what the people who are in the system to service them have their interests at heart, not their own. But again, it's the policy drivers that have changed.
It's got to be a balance. So a lot of we spend, I don't know, $8, $9, $10 billion a year on training delivery and the system in general. So that's public money, which should go to a public good. It should create a public good, and that public good, in my view, is a functioning, effective workforce.
Yeah.
I think the Germans have a line that translates to high quality vocational education is a precondition for economic and social prosperity, which I believe in. So public funding of VET should produce a public good, a skilled and an adaptable workforce getting about its business. So when we've created a commodity now that is training delivery to exploit the availability of the funds, that higher purpose is starting to be diluted. Not every person who's in the VET system has an employer. So it's not all about that employer, it's about the nature of work in the broad sense. It's about employment in the broad sense. So a lot of people who may work for an employer are doing VET to move to a different employer, a better opportunity down the track. The system's trying to be all things to all people, but at its heart, it should be about the production of skilled and adaptable workers who go on to employment, and that's the public good that we're looking to create out of public money. My concern is that it is not the student, the apprentice or the worker or the employer that is exploiting that, and I think you're exactly right that flexibility is being exploited by the wrong party in the deal for the wrong reason, and they're almost forced to. Now, we have all sorts of rules about customisation, contextualisation and flexibility in relation to individual students, but you can't deliver a class of one for every possible combination.
It's got to be commercially viable.
I think
just let me finish this point about public funding.
Yeah.
That if we are putting public money on the table, the public expects a quality result. The pursuit of flexibility for commercial advantage is not that public good that we're looking to create.
I think, look, there's always been you have to be realistic. Just because we've developed a set of standards, it hasn't ever meant that it would automatically be delivered. And just because we've developed a certain degree of flexibility or non-flexibility in packaging rules doesn't mean that will automatically be the same how it's delivered everywhere. Training providers have to make realistic choices according to who's their market, who's rocking up to them wanting training.
I would agree if that's what their consideration was, but I don't think it is.
It varies around,
Yeah.
Leon, and I think one of the interesting points is that we've had for a long time now a mix of public and private training. We all know that in manufacturing in MEM. Nearly all of MEM, especially at the trade level, gets delivered by large training providers, primarily TAFEs. But the system now is changing, and this is one of the things that has not grabbed as much attention, is that in the move from the SSOs to the Job and Skill Councils, the rules around who is responsible for developing the qualifications in a formal way have also changed. That we've now seen the previous industry reference committees who had responsibility under the SSO format go out, and now there are a stronger role for final decision making within the Job and Skill Councils. There is a more formal role for training providers to have a say around the content and the packaging rules, rather than that being decided, if you like, at a more industry level. Now, we've got to see how that plays out. I personally think the training system is going to find the same problems industry parties have found for years, that which are the one or two training providers you put on a national committee, and are they going to be able to successfully represent and talk from the point of view of all the training providers that deliver MEM. We'll have to see how that pans out. But I think the new system will still have the same type of, let's say, speed to market problems, because you'll still get funding decision makers, you'll still get state and territory training authorities looking at how they want to match what comes out of the standards and the training packages to here in New South Wales, smart and skilled, and all the rules and structures around that. The ITAB has to deal with that. One aspect of the current system, which I think is what you're alluding to, is that there's now a stronger and more formal role for, let's say, non-industry players in the development of the standards qualifications.
We're worshipping the bureaucracy.
Well, I'm just saying I think it's a bit early to see whether that actually changes anything.
Yeah.
I think in my money...
We all live in hope.
My money...
No, we don't.
My money is that it won't change too much. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like a retrograde step.
I just want to go back to the core of our subject matter today about the package, and particularly around things like the point system, and we have an assessor system that is called MEAS, and I just want to explore that for a minute, and the ability for, particularly reclassification in the workplace and work job redesign. Because that's one of the things in the current environment where we've got massive labour shortages across all sectors. There's a mechanism there that we have that is able to help employers to adjust and to modernise their workplace. Maybe you might want to have a little bit of a comment on that.
Could I come at that from, and we often talk, Richard and I, about the dual purpose of MEM competency standards. One of those purposes is to allow for the specification of what a worker should look like, and that specification goes over to a training provider with the aim of meeting that standard by producing a skilled or qualified worker. So that's the formal sort of application of competency standards from a training delivery point of view. The less discussed part of the system, it's often discussed in a quite derogatory sense by many, who keep saying, well, why do we have to talk about industrial relations when we're talking about competency standards in manufacture? We have to talk about them because they are the primary vehicle for determining the value of certain jobs and occupations. They are the primary vehicle to assist workplaces in working out what a job looks like. Industry is the owner and designer of jobs and occupations, and that is done using competency standards in the manufacturing award, because the award was set up for that purpose. I mentioned 60% of people in the industry at the time of this had no post-school qualification, but they had heaps of skills. We often talk about skilled, unskilled and semi-skilled workers. I've never come across any more offensive term in my life in the world of work than the notion that somebody could be semi-skilled or unskilled. There is nobody who has no skills. You don't employ people on the basis that they have no skills. So those derogatory terms had to go, and we needed to replace them with something that gave people some sense of their worth and value in the world of work, and competency standards are the measure of that, and they have worked well in terms of that process. You don't see large-scale disputes about the individual classification level of people anymore, because we have processes to deal with them, sophisticated processes that work. So we don't have that industrial disputation. The competency standards were a means of avoiding and preventing industrial disputes about the value of work. It's important. We are able to give someone a competency profile that is based on what skills and knowledge they require as expressed by competency standards to do the work they're engaged to do. And for many people, that's the first significant recognition that they've had. And that is incredibly important to lifting people's gaze, to giving them some sort of confidence, some sense of pride that their skills have been articulated, and that they can have some pride in the fact that this is how I go about doing my work. It's been sort of codified in a way. So that second purpose is about recognising people's skills in the workforce for classification and pay, for career progression, But also importantly, it's about identifying any gaps in that as well, so that we can use the formal training system or the best parts of it to fill those gaps and create a more competent worker, if I can mash up that term in that way. So that dual purpose is as important, if not more important today, because that's how we incrementally shift the skills of an individual existing worker to move on to deal with changes in technology, workflow, materials, work organisation and job design. And we need to talk more about how we can compile competency profiles for jobs and occupations for the purposes of working out what skills do people have, what skills do people need, how we're going to give them the skills that they might need to fill those gaps.
Ian and I obviously haven't agreed on everything over the years. We've been paid to disagree with each other a lot. But look, the use of the competency standards in workplaces is a flow on that from that big change I mentioned before. From an employer point of view, we never hear people wanting to go back to measure people according to their tasks. It's now become embedded and well accepted that we should be looking to pay and recognise people on a skills basis, not where they can use a ring spanner or a wrench or whatever. So in most employers, even in overaward pays, they do a negotiation around what is the value in that workplace of the different levels of skills. When we moved people over from that old award to the new, we did a process called broadbanding. And people moved across. If you were at the old level as a tradesperson, you moved across to C10 if you were at the base trade. For example, 90% people moved across in a way that was accepted, but there was always, misfits, whether at the enterprise level or sectors. Competency standards were used back then as a way of dealing with those things that broadbanding hadn't got quite right. And it did that in a good way and in a way that helped solve those issues. That issues still come up at workplaces where people want to know the value in award terms of a job or a particular employee. The competency standards are a good tool for helping resolve those issues. And in the MES system, we make sure that we have
what's MES stand for?
Manufacturing and Engineering Assessment Service.
Yeah.
System, sorry. That people go through a one-day course understanding how the competency standards match to the award and can be used for classification purposes. They get registered as a MES assessor. And that system works well in trying to help those situations where things are in dispute. Ian alluded to the occupational profiles. He's probably a stronger advocate than I am for those national profiles, and I'm not. They're entitled to push that. My own view is that there are some occupations where having national profiles works better than in other areas. In the trades, I think it works fairly good. People have a common understanding, a strong common understanding of what a particular trade mix of skills is. There are other areas in the production areas and in the technician areas where there's not as strong a history of let's say, of the box of skills. So my view is that occupational profiles is something I would want to look at on an issue by issue basis, rather than just a global saying we should have a mass of them.
Could I just put that to bed?
Well, I'll just finish first and say, in a way, a qualification packaging rule is an occupational profile. There's a lot of discussions go at trying to decide in an agreed way what will be the amount of prescription versus the amount of flexibility in that. And that debate will happen in occupational profiles. I don't think there'll be one answer to it.
We produced a series of what we call these occupational profiles, but I don't think in any of them we are mandating every unit of competency that needs to be in it. So we've had regard to that, and what we've done is analyse packaging rules that are used by RTOs. So we've picked up group training.
When
many
you were saying
group training,
you mean the union?
I meant the union
Yeah.
back when I was doing that work.
Yeah.
So I was leading an approach that says, what are the most common units being used in many of these, and many of them are trade and technical profile. But our concept of occupational profiling only works where consistency is a key thing. And if we can get to a point where we know that a welder is predominantly out of the 96 points that we use to define the value of a certificate 3, where say 86 of those units are common across the board, then there is a public good created by trying to maximise class sizes across the board. We can get the training system to deliver a consistent product. Employers will know what they're getting when somebody rolls in with a qualification. They don't have to analyse what's on the back of it to see whether they actually have any welding units in their qualification. The occupational profiling concept is good for what it's good for. It's applicable across a range of different areas of the economy. It's not just about manufacturing, but where consistency is a good thing and a desired thing, then that's the approach that we would promote, or the AMWU was promoting, as a way forward to produce those workers with some consistency. It makes the management of training, delivery, resources, assessment regimes, all of that you could create, and we were at that time promoting a national curriculum for some of these occupations. But it's not going to fix everything, won't fix many problems, but it will fix the problem that it's meant to fix. Okay. So that dual purpose around job design, work organisation, and the notion that the competency standards were first and foremost a tool for the prevention and settlement of industrial disputes around the design of work and the value of work, and that is a purpose that the competency standards have met very well and continue to this day. We have sophisticated arrangements and rules about how you assess someone for competence for the purposes of classification, which is quite a different assessment regime, but it works as a settlement and prevention of industrial disputes as an award provision, and the assessment does not need to be an assessment to the sort of standard that ASQA would require from a training delivery role, because the application of the standard in that workplace may not require all of the performance evidence or knowledge evidence, because the work does not require it. Mm-hmm. So it has to serve that purpose of recognising skills, because there are still so many workers that have no post-school qualifications to prove the level of their competency.
Yeah.
I'll just qualify that is the union's view. There's a lot in what Ian has said that has got to, I think, be worked through before we get to a common industrial position on some of that. But
well, we do. Yeah. The award has its provisions.
Look, we could go all day, and we've gone over quite a bit of the history, a summary of how the system or the MEM package is being used, and we can see that there's a real opportunity for us in the future. Did you have something?
Just one last point. Much of what Richard and I have talked through today is available through the Jobs and Skills Council. We have a document that we produced for the MEM2, which was an essential features guide. Much of what we've talked about is probably articulated a bit more coherently in that document. If people want more information about that, they can source that off the website.
VetNet, I think, is you go to the training package in training.
It's one of the companion volumes, but it was written to try and expand on some of these concepts.
Yeah, even about the competency standards implementation guide, it's there as well.
Yep.
I'll provide in the show notes links to those things for people to go and have a look if they want to investigate that further. Any of the topics that you've heard today, we welcome interaction and feedback on this of our first podcast from an MSA perspective. I'd like to thank you both for being open and reasonable. I know we've been in discussions that haven't always been reasonable, but we always come to a conclusion where we have a consensus of sorts. I really appreciate that. And although you'll both still continue to be involved with MSA, you've got your bits of work that you continue as legacy from either your previous career as the national training
coordinator, skills training and apprenticeships.
Yeah, Ian won't let go. I don't think we won't let him go either. One of the things that I constantly say about the people who I meet, and there's a lot of grey-haired men that I know, but they've passed some of their knowledge on to me, and they've probably forgot more than I know. So I really appreciate the openness and the transparency around your thoughts.
If I can just look, Ian and I have taken part in this podcast as individuals who've had a lot of history in MEM. But if I can just briefly put on the hat and add to what you've said as chair of MSA, MSA is now liberated from the formal training package development and review role, and it allows us as an organisation to try and encourage, interest in debate in manufacturing vocational training. Leon, it's good that you've organised this, but certainly within the board of MSA, we want a healthy level of discussion and debate. We want to actively encourage that, whether it's on MEM or any of the other sectors of manufacturing, because MSA, and I think you said at the beginning, MSA isn't just about the MEM sector. There are other sectors, process manufacturing, food processing and others, that we try and also promote vocational training in those sectors. And we are at the beginning of a series of podcasts that we hope encourage very strong interest and debate in vocational training in manufacturing, because one thing Ian and I are in total agreement of is that we think manufacturing is a good industry. It's a good industry for people to get into, and we want to encourage people to consider manufacturing as a career.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, on that note, I'll finish up and thank you both.
Okay, thanks, Leon.
Thanks, Aaron.